Welcome back. Congrats on completing the first module of the course. You've taken another step in investing in understanding your own context and ministry context for the gospel. In the last module, we learnt about the different distinctives of Asian and Western culture. We looked at cultural dimensions of power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and low and high context cultures, noting the differences between our ancestral country and our current host countries. This is a crucial first step in mutual understanding and respect. In this module, we are going to understand how God's original design for cultures and ethnicities doesn't work as intended. We'll explore how Asian cultural differences function and how sin can damage the relationship between Asians from Asia and Asians between cultures. When we fail to understand this, instead of people of different cultures working well together, we will contribute to the tension and hurt by invalidating struggles and failing to pastorally care for Asians between cultures. There are no generic Christians. This module explores the specific ways Asians between cultures may have been broken and sin. Firstly, we'll take a look at the first arrow on the top. As Asians between cultures, we have to live with the expectations and values from Asians from Asia, whether it be our families, our church, or our extended Asian communities, people you might see at your language school. There are different ways these expectations and values are passed on to us, with either overt or subtle pressure to be more Asian. Think about the times where there was a big family dinner or a wedding celebration, or maybe your ethnic church is having a combined service or a committee meeting. In what ways do we receive either overt or subtle pressure to conform to the expectations and the values of our Asian backgrounds? For example, in my own Chinese context, there is high power distance, low individualism, and high context communication. Now, this looks like filial piety, being expected to respect and obey our elders and teachers. It's also a collective culture where we need to be mindful of how our words and behavior affect the entire group. There is indirect communication, so we need to smile and save face even if we don't feel like it. Randall L. Nadeau talks about how Confucianism emphasizes orthopraxy, right action, over orthodoxy, right belief. There's an emphasis on education and the arts, harmonious hierarchical relations, and a ritual and ceremonial living. What other Asian philosophies might underpin your Asian heritage? Now, these values and expectations are then passed on to us. There is overt pressure. For example, what are considered acceptable professions like doctor, lawyer, engineer? Acceptable marriage partners, those within the family's ethnicity. There are expectations to look after parents when they're old. Expectations to learn language and speak it at home. Expectations to learn a musical instrument. Expectations on when one is allowed to date. Expectations on when to get married and when to have children. But more often than not, these pressures are subtle. They are like paper cuts, small comments here and there, or a certain look. For example, about our weight, our marital status, our academic achievement or lack of it, or the lack of overt affection. Gerald Wing-Soo uses the term microaggressions, defined as brief everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of their group membership. Now, the persons making the comments may otherwise be well-intentioned and unaware of the potential impact of their words. Now, some examples are phrases like, what happened to the other 5%? Smile, are you married? You've gotten fatter. Or you can't quit, I spent so much money on these lessons. Or look at that auntie's child, they are doing so well. So the more exposure we have, or the more you try to connect with this community, the more pressure you will receive. And the degree we conform to these Asian pressures and expectations is connected with the degree of acceptance we receive. So how do Asians between cultures handle this pressure? As we are being pressured to be more Asian, it's often a condition of our belonging and acceptance in our families and communities. So if you're trying to belong and be accepted, it's really difficult to criticize or talk back for fear of being marginalized or even kicked out. Sometimes scripture can be misused to keep us silent. Honor your father and mother can make us believe that we can't voice our struggles and hurt. Even when we try, we might feel gaslighted, told that our struggles are nothing, that we're too weak, just to be grateful and to stop complaining. We feel misunderstood, invalidated. So instead of speaking out, we may internalize it. Instead of other people taking responsibility for the way they may have hurt us, we think it's our own problem. We may start to feel shame when we don't conform to Asian expectations. We may feel like we are not enough. We may start to believe that we only have value if we conform to our Asian community's expectations of us. And also, research has shown that at least in America, second-generation Asian Americans, particularly females, experience higher rates of low mental health outcomes, more than any other demographic group. We might find our self-worth in our academic achievements. For those that don't meet these expectations, there can be a profound sense of failure. This pressure can also affect the way we view God. For some of us, how we feel toward our parents may transfer onto God. He may appear distant, busy, authoritarian, or not safe with our honest feelings. We may also feel like we aren't good enough for him. We may think he thinks of us as weak, dramatic, or ungrateful. All of this Asian pressure is what author Sarah Shin calls ethnic brokenness. And in this case, our Asian heritage and culture is corrupted by the influence of sin. So what is the result of the internalization of this pressure? Well, there are two ways it can go wrong. In the first way, it starts to go wrong in the way we relate to other Asians. There is a big distance when it comes to relating with our parents and our extended families, or a big distance when it comes to working with the first generation in our ethnic churches. Now, this distance can be emotional or psychological. For some, this distance is also geographical, as some parents work overseas. We may have broken relationships with other Asians, and this might cause some Asians between cultures to find refuge in Caucasian communities of friends. Another way it can go wrong is for some Asians between cultures is that it affects our relationships with Caucasian people. Sometimes, though, for some people, this pressure to be more Asian leads us to be too proud of our culture, so much so that we may look down on Anglo-Australian or Western culture and stereotype them as not smart or bogan. And this is what I did when I was growing up. I would associate Chinese with smart and Westerner as less smart. But I've since learned that I am not seeing these people as made in the image of God. Stereotyping a whole group of people is not helpful nor loving, and frankly, this is sin. So let's consider, where have you felt the pressures from your Asian community? How did you deal with these pressures, and in what ways might have this ethnic brokenness resulted in sin and brokenness, shown either towards the Asian community or the Caucasian community? We are now aware of pressures arising from our cultural differences, but adding on other pressures such as differences in worldview, whether postmodern or modern, generational, language, and for some, geographical barriers, we can see why sometimes the first and second generation find it really difficult to get along. I'd just like to reiterate, though, that there is nothing wrong with our families helping us retain our ethnic heritage. In fact, it is a good thing. I too am trying to teach my daughter to be proud of her Chineseness and getting her to experience as much Asian culture as possible. But what we are interested in, though, is how these cultural expectations and values function in a fallen world. Though our Asian communities may have good intentions, in their fallenness, it's impossible to pass it on perfectly. So for many Asians between cultures, sometimes it can be a confusing and hurtful journey of ethnic brokenness. And it's okay to acknowledge that sin has corrupted this process, both from our Asian communities and potentially ourselves. Please have a go of the questions in your workbook, and I'll see you in the next module.